So many historians identify two major conflicts within Europe in the 1800s. One is economic, that we've already gone over, especially industrialization, and the mass kind of social dislocations that we talked about from industrialization, the kind of psychological problems that people had with dealing with this new production method, increased efficiency, factory wages and working lifestyles, and the rise of gigantic cities. So that's one part of the 1800s that inspires people to complain about what government's doing, complain about their daily lives. There's a whole other part of the political 1800s, especially in Europe. And this one is the result of largely the French Revolution, where the people of one of the major countries of Europe had risen up, gotten rid of their monarchy in every single way you could think of, right down to the execution of the king, and proclaimed a government that was focused on liberty, equality, democracy. And when Napoleon is defeated in 1815, the kings of Europe come together and they try to get rid of those ideas from European politics. They redraw the map of Europe, they put new monarchs back on thrones, and they really try to go back to the way things were before the French Revolution ever started. It's easy to do that militarily, to rebuild governments and put people in charge, but it's almost impossible to do socially. Because once the ideas of the French Revolution are out and have spread to largely the rest of Europe, people still think about them. So they have political complaints. They want voting rights, they want democracy, they want some kind of freedom, political freedom, guarantees of citizenship, or guarantees of rights. But their governments are still run by kings, or their kings are put back in place. So that's the major kind of political conflict of the 1800s. And it merges with the economic conflicts of the Industrial Revolution. And you get epidemic series of revolutions, people rising up against their own governments throughout the 1800s and literally throwing their kings out and trying to figure out what to do after that. So to put this very bluntly and quickly, the history of much of Europe in the 1800s is the restoration of the old 1700s monarchies, the creation of mass politics, a system of revolutions, people's rising up against those restored monarchies, and then the attempt of the elites to consolidate power and to keep power. So it is very much a conflict of the 1700 style of government versus the visions of the French Revolution, the visions of a lot of people in society. In 1815, after they defeated Napoleon again, the leaders of Europe went back to Vienna and held what they called, again, the Congress of Vienna, to write up the peace treaty and redraw the map of Europe. And they do. And they take the former monarchs, the former royal families of Europe, that Napoleon and others had overthrown, and they put them back on their thrones, and they literally try to wind the clock back to the 1780s as best they can. It's successful in the very short term, in that they do rebuild governments, they do put monarchs back on the throne. But a lot of those governments don't last very long. They even take the younger brother of the executed King of France, because the French king had been executed, his wife and his children his wife had been executed, his two children died in prison. So that part of the French royal family is just wiped out. So they go to the former king's younger brother and make him the next king of France. And that is wildly unpopular in France. And this is what the new map of Europe looks like. So the French people, after a couple years of this, are already upset and seem to be willing to strike back at their monarchy again and possibly start a new revolution at some point. And the European leaders understand this. They are very afraid that a new revolution would hit France and that the old process would start. The French people would rise up, they would start invading other countries, and the whole mess would start all over again. So the European leaders were very concerned with creating large and very powerful governments on the French borders. Governments in the Netherlands, Holland, Switzerland, Parma, They build up those governments to be very large and militarily powerful to resist possible future French invasion. Portugal is recreated as a government. A lot of the German countries come together to theoretically defend against future French aggression. And the problem of the future of France is really the biggest problem of the whole treaty meetings. So the major powers of Europe at these meetings decide to form a treaty amongst themselves. So the four countries that were mostly responsible for defeating Napoleon come together and sign a treaty that they call the Quadruple Alliance, which is literally Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria. They agree that if France ever rises up and tries to invade other countries, again, that all four of them will immediately attack France. So this is seen as an anti-revolutionary group in a lot of ways. And it's interesting because within a few years, the King of France even joins this treaty.
Can't beat him, join him, right?
Yeah. And not only that, but the King of France doesn't want to see revolutions in France either. So he will join this treaty as a symbolic gesture that the French nation is still powerful, and that the French people also stand against, what these monarchs call instability, probably what we would today call terrorism or something like this. But these are some of the conservative leaders of Europe. This treaty system, it's theoretically in effect for about 100 years, but it starts to break down pretty quickly because revolutions start to hit. What do these revolutions want? There are three different major theories of kind of politics, political coming together. And each of these three theories will argue against the kind of monarchism style of government that the kings would try to put back in power. And probably the biggest long-term theory against this kind of authoritarian dictatorship power centered in a king is what we would today call liberalism, or what they then called liberalism even. And that's the idea that government should be voted on by the people, that the citizens should elect their own representatives to lead them, that the citizens should have a vote. And liberalism basically says that the individual person is trustworthy and smart enough to understand that they should vote for politicians that would defend their own individual interests. And the liberals say that if you as an individual voter are looking at candidates, you're most likely to vote for the candidate who says he's going to uphold your rights to own property, maybe lower taxes on your class of people, stuff like that, pretty common sense stuff. So liberals tend to really believe that the individual voter should be the source of political power. And of course, when you have millions and millions of them together, politicians would have to advertise their own ideas to the masses in order to get elected into office. And he said that individuals are, most likely to vote to support their own natural rights. So there's a kind of melding together of a lot of revolutionary statements from the American Declaration of Independence and from the French Revolution about these universal rights that everybody should have. And the liberal theorists came together and said the most likely system for long-term stability is to give everybody a vote. Therefore, they'll vote for politicians that would uphold those natural rights. Therefore, you won't get revolutions because people will be fairly free and equal. A lot of these theorists want to restrict the vote. They're not completely egalitarian types. They usually reject voting rights for women for many decades after this. And that's a argument that goes into the mid to late 1800s, especially in Europe, and even later in the United States. And a lot of these people want to restrict voting rights to landowners. So you'd have to at least own an acre or two, be an average kind of farmer, in order to get some kind of right at the ballot box. But these are mostly people who are interested in what we would today call representative democracy, where you get a voting right to, you have an election and you choose someone from your community to go up to the capital city and write laws, or vote on laws, or whatever they're going to do. Most of the liberals want what they called constitutional monarchy, which means exactly as it sounds. You're going to have a written constitution where the powers of government are clearly laid out, and things that government aren't allowed to do, most likely. And that will often be led by a king in the executive branch. So this was seen as a compromise between the monarchs, the monarchists of Europe, who want kings and think that kings are like the linchpin of society still, and that if you get rid of the king, everything goes to hell. So this is seen as a kind of bringing together of the monarchists and the people who wanted more voting rights for the masses. It's interesting, though, because often the greatest support for this kind of democracy came from the rich in society, the rising factory owners, what Marx called the bourgeoisie. They thought that this would be a good bargain for them also. And why do you think that is? Yeah, exactly, because the wealthy business owners recognized that they would probably be able to direct politics by using their money in elections. So they realized that they could get a greater voice in the government, at least on par with the king, and they could legitimize that by saying, well, the people voted for this, or voted for these candidates or politicians or laws or whatever you're talking about. So you see the wealthy very quickly going into the system and systematically analyzing and realizing that this could be beneficial for them also. So questions about this at all? Pretty clear? All right. Another one was nationalism. And one of the problems of the 1815 treaty system was that it redrew the map of Europe regardless of areas of nationality or ethnicity. The meetings at Vienna were mostly run by the kings. And the kings mostly argued over each other over pieces of land in Europe, who gets what. So a lot of the peace treaty system that was eventually built was built more on compromises amongst kings than trying to identify, which nationality should be living under which government. So you often get these very strange kind of multinational, multi-ethnic empires that are rebuilt that will not be very stable going into the future. So in the wake of 1815, a new kind of political theory rises up that's generally identified as nationalism, that says that government should be built up according to ethnic majorities or cultural majorities, and that those people would come together for their own mutual defense because they speak the same language, they have the same traditions and culture and whatnot, and that would be the greatest source for long-term stability. One of the major problems with that is that a lot of these nationalistic feelings often become almost religious in themselves as people start to identify, themselves amongst some kind of majority. They can say that the majority should be running the country, but what happens to the minority groups? They can often be pushed aside or used as scapegoats when things go wrong. So the upside of nationalism is, bring everybody together under this kind of shared identity, but not everybody in society looks and talks exactly the same, or comes from the same place, or believes in the same ideas. So those that are viewed as outside the majority can be often pushed aside or attacked. And that's the major downside of this theory. And just like today, conservatives also often talk about how great this idea is because this becomes a kind of system of normalcy. conservatives at their core usually do not want to change things. So conservatives often use this idea of nationalism and patriotism to convince people to keep doing what they'd always been doing, which is basically let the government run things. So many conservatives like this idea of nationalism because it tends to keep people from questioning things. If someone who looks and talks like you is running the government, then sometimes people are unwilling to question those government leaders no matter what they're doing. And if someone looks different from you, they'll often question that leader, again, no matter what they're doing. So we obviously see a lot of this stuff going on today still. One thing, though, that conservatives did not like is that nationalism can very quickly mobilize the masses, emotionally, irrationally. So some conservatives said that this could be useful, but it also has a major problem in the future. What if the people get so hyped up that they decide to start a revolution against the leadership? That's the major problem, or one of the major problems with that one. And the third one is much more economic. This one becomes known as socialism. And this is a theory that the rich have the good life and they have all the money and they don't have to work very much, and the poor working classes are working themselves to death basically under what Marx would eventually call wage slavery. So the socialists will say that there should be a much better distribution, equal distribution of wealth in society through taxation usually, and welfare systems and whatnot, unemployment systems or workers' compensation systems for being injured on the job. That the average people of society have to have some kind of economic stability so that they can survive. One of the long-term problems of this is when you start taking this to its logical extremes, you start creating economies that are completely run by governments. And this is obviously another major source of political debate ongoing today. How much of a role should government have in the economy? So there's a lot of economic and political theorists that get involved in that question. And it is fairly well proven that when the government runs every single part of the economy in a society, that those economies don't tend to grow very fast. They're not very innovative. And we'll see a lot more of that once we get to the Soviet Union. So socialism as an idea was around already by the 1800s, but especially after 1815, you get the emergence of this, or the growth of this factory-based production system, where workers are leaving the farms and going into factories and working long hours in dangerous places for very little pay and very, very little job security. You start getting the kind of coalescing of these social ideas, socialist ideas. And of course, after Marx comes along and gives his very heavy critique of this stuff and calls for worldwide revolution, a lot of socialist ideas and a lot of socialists get tied to communism. They get accused of communism or being a Marxist. But there are major differences between socialists and Marxists, right? Socialists and communists. Largely, the communists want the government to run all the factories and run all production. Socialists often don't. They tend to like having private companies run things. They just want government to guarantee competition and good wages for workers and stuff like that. So there's a big difference between communism and socialism, general socialism. So questions about any of these at all? I know this is pretty theoretical stuff, but it becomes important in politics as we go forward. These ideas will rise and fall up until today. Yeah.
This may be a better question for later on, but I'm just curious, what do you think our government is? Is it more socialistic now?
I think it's completely socialistic. Okay. I mean, we're sitting in a school that has government funding, right?
Yeah.
That's a socialist system. We have a large military force. The United States government spends hundreds of billions of dollars on a year. That's a socialist system. It's taking tax revenue, and taxes are collected from the people, and it is being spent for something that theoretically benefits all society. I mean, highway systems, roads, government-funded research. I mean, all kinds of things. There's a lot of aspects of the U.S. economy that are socialistic. And I hear a lot of people saying that we should get rid of socialism entirely in the United States, and I honestly don't think they understand what that would entail. I mean, we would close down all these schools, all government-funded schools, and hope that private companies would be able to run schools. I think I only have one friend that actually advocates fully getting rid of socialism while understanding what that means. He wants all the roads to be privately owned. He wants all the water supply to be private, all the schools. He wants all that stuff privatized. That's his political idea. He thinks that the government is inherently corrupt, and the best way to solve that problem is to not give the government enough money to do damage.
Would it cost people more? I mean, you'd have to pay toll roads. That's
an open question. His argument is that you're already paying taxes on gasoline that keeps the roads functioning, theoretically as much as they are functioning. You already pay taxes per gallon of gas. So his argument is that if you add up the amount of tax that you pay per year through buying gasoline and compare that to how much you would theoretically pay for private roads, to me the experiment would have to be run. We'd have to take a state or something and just privatize all the roads and see what happens. Or, small town, but it would have to be something large enough to be comparable where you could extrapolate the results and apply it to... Yeah.
Like the post office and everything.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I have a different idea. I'd more like to see us get rid of the corruption. I think that would solve a lot of problems. But when me and him are in the same room, that debate goes on and on and on and on and on. And it goes on for hours and hours until we're both so tired that we have to go home and go to sleep. That's it. That's the way it goes. Oh, he would love to come into class and talk about these things. He's a student still, though. He's just now getting his bachelor's. I don't know. I have to talk to him and see how close he is. I think he might have finished last spring. I don't know. But he's a very busy person. But that's his political idea, and he's very much into it. And there's a movie that was just released called Atlas Shrugged. You guys heard of this? That is very much dedicated to these ideas. It's going to be released in who knows how many different volumes. Part 2 just came out a couple weeks ago. But it's based on a 1,200-page book. But it's completely dedicated to those ideas that socialism has not worked and is destroying the economy, so we have to privatize everything. And that no one should have to pay taxes, and there's a lot of stuff in there. So it's an interesting idea. And the main character I just saw the second part. The main character literally says that paying taxes is the equivalent to a burglar coming into your house in the middle of the night and stealing your stuff. I disagree, but just me. But that's their theory. So that's a very famous book. And there's a big group in West LA. I can't remember exactly the city, like Pacific Palisades or something, or Santa Monica, somewhere around there. They have a whole center of study dedicated to studying those books and that author's ideas and trying to apply them and convince politicians to apply them in society. It's a big, big movement. And it's very heavily also identified with the Tea Party movement. A lot of those politicians believe in this stuff. And if you ask a lot, like Ron Paul, he's a big Ayn Rand fan. Named his kid after Ayn Rand. And that's the author of the book, so, yeah. So there's big debates going on now. But getting back to the 1800s, so they set up these systems. There are alternative theories, especially those three that we talked about. They're floating around societies, and people are debating these in coffee houses and libraries and beer halls and out in society. People are talking about politics, and the governments can't really do much to stop people from talking about politics, right? And it's possible to stop people from thinking about things, unless you're George Orwell. But so these discussions go on, and a lot of the European peoples are not very happy with the new political order that was established at the Congress of Vienna. And within just a few years, you get a new system of revolutions. There's a revolution in Spain in 1820, where the monarch of Spain had actually suspended the Spanish Constitution, and the Spanish people didn't like that very much, so they started a revolution against him. There's a revolution in Naples, which is down here in southern Italy, for much the same reason. Revolution in Portugal. Those are mostly kind of issues over constitutionality and the role of monarchs in the government and kind of guarantees of people's rights. The leaders of the Concert of Europe, especially the Quadruple Alliance, they have to sit down because they've taken it upon themselves to enforce the new order, to keep stability. So those four countries have to have conferences about whether or not they should send, say, the British Army into Spain and put down the Spanish Revolution. So that is a big topic of conversation. You know, once a revolution hits, are the most powerful governments going to send in their militaries into these countries and shoot into the crowd, disperse the revolutions, and basically crush it? So that's a major topic of debate. An even murkier one is when Greece goes into revolution. Greece is down here, part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Quadruple Alliance has the problem here. They would obviously like to get their forces together and support the Greek Revolution because making Greece independent would be a de facto attack against the Muslim Empire, which, of course, the Europeans are great fans of because they want to kick the Muslims out of the area and really eradicate the Ottoman Empire completely. So there are long-term debates about whether or not the Quadruple Alliance should gather together and attack what they consider to be a foreign enemy and justify this by supporting the natural rights of European peoples, notably the Greeks. It takes them 5 or 6 years to come to a decision, but they eventually do intervene. And especially the Russian army intervenes, and that largely just breaks down to a Russian versus Ottoman war in 1828. So those are some of the earlier revolutions. Another big one breaks out in the big country. France goes into revolution in 1830 against its monarchy. The French people do not want these kings around anymore. These are the kings from the old monarchy, their old royal family. Guy whose head they cut off in 1793. So the younger brother had died by this point, and there was another king who was appointed, Charles X or something like that. But this is a revolution against that second guy, and the revolution succeeds. Negotiations begin with the other European leaders, and basically this French Revolution will not so much overturn the complete government like the first French Revolution, but they instead just basically choose a new king. So they pick out a popular guy named Louis. They call him Louis Égalité, which means the Louis of freedom, basically, the Louis of equality. So they kind of trust this guy more than the previous king, put him on the throne, and he promises to rule for the benefit of all people and whatnot. But this is an interesting painting because it depicts a lot of different parts of society all rising up at the same time. Obviously women, industrialists, rich people, factory workers, or farmers, factory workers backgrounds, even children. And this is a depiction of socialism. Anytime you see a person with a kind of red scarf like that, red signifies socialism, and had already signified it by the 1700s. So this painting is famous because it seems like a kind of amalgam of all the different parts of society that are all rising up at the same time. Other revolutions occur in 1830. Belgium goes into revolution against Holland, basically because the people living in what they identified as Belgium wanted an independent country. Same thing with Poland. The Polish people go into revolution against the Russian government trying to become separate, an independent country again. Eventually the Russian army invades and crushes that revolution as fast as possible. So revolutions in the 1800s in Europe are epidemic already by 1830. And this is only 15 years after the end of Napoleon. So questions about any of that so far?
Why did the Quadruple Alliance attack the French people when they started?
Why didn't the...
It wasn't that the whole alliance was to attack?
Yeah.
They didn't want another French Revolution.
And it's an open question if foreigners attack the French people, are the French people willing to stand for it? Will that just encourage them more to fight back? Just like, when there's an uprising in Iran in 2009, where the people are taking to the streets and the government's obviously murdering a lot of its own people, there's an open question about whether or not the United States should intervene in that. If the United States intervened, would that help the Iranian people overthrow their own government, or would the government use that as an excuse to bring the Iranian people together to resist a foreign invasion? That's the big question. And in that instance, in that revolution in France, it just happened so fast that the Quadruple Alliance didn't really have much time to react. And it happens in just a matter of a couple of weeks. Other questions? No. Basically, the Quadruple Alliance, it says it wants to defend stability, but it's not very good at it. Because there are 4 members of it, and eventually 5 when you include the French monarchy. And each of those countries also has its own interest. They want to, like the British will want to hurt French power in Europe more than be really interested in guaranteeing stability. Or the Russians will look to hurt Austrian influence. So there's infighting even amongst the members of the Quadruple Alliance, and it's very difficult. Just like, say, the United Nations or NATO or something today. When you have these large organizations, the individual countries will try to grow their own power by using the larger group. And that is very obviously still happening in a lot of different ways today. The big year, though, is 1848. So we're going to skip ahead, 18 years pretty quickly. 1848, we'll see a lot of revolutions basically all at the same time. And this is one of the most studied events in all of the European 1800s. 1848 is the big year. So historians have identified several different reasons for the quick rising up of all these revolutions. And really, number one amongst them is that Europe is going into industrialization very fast, and it was very upsetting to large populations. Oftentimes, people who worked in factories, or people who felt that these factory owners are not giving them a fair shake, they will sometimes try to go on strike. That usually doesn't work, but very often they'll break into the factories in the middle of the night when everything's supposed to be shut down, and they'll burn it down, or they'll destroy the machines. So there's an anti-industrialization movement, social movement that's often going on already by 1848, and that's seen as one of the major factors in kind of bringing people together in their complaint. Industrialization was also harming the traditional farming life that Europeans and most world peoples had lived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. This is a new method of work. This is a new kind of reality. And people struggled with it, and we talked about that last time also. With industrialization, people were moving into large cities, even small towns that are quickly growing into large cities. And they didn't like living in those cities. Those cities were usually pretty miserable places. There's a lot of poverty. There's obviously a lot of unemployment. There's a lot of crime, alcoholism, disease. There aren't many good living standards that are enforced by government. So you often get, say, 15 people living in one apartment. You've heard all these kinds of horrible stories. So when one person gets the flu, it spreads like wildfire. And back then there weren't many vaccinations for a lot of really horrible diseases that we've largely eradicated in the industrialized world today. So things like smallpox and polio and all kinds of different stuff could eradicate populations in cities fairly quickly. There are systems of crop failures. Basically, the European population starts growing so fast again, and when disease spreads to a lot of the crops out in the farms, it kills them off. So there's a lot of different famines in Europe in the 1840s especially, and especially in Ireland. So people are miserable, and of course when they're hungry or unemployed, they tend to blame government, and that often starts at least complaint movements that can grow into revolutions. And by 1848, those did grow into revolutionary sentiment. And one of the big ones is also a change in the source of wealth and political power. Just as when we first talked about in this semester, where you had the landowners that control basically everything, who had access to the king. That started to change a little bit when you get the rise of mercantilism. International buyers and sellers start getting rich, and they start getting so rich that they can influence politics. In the 1800s, the new source of wealth are factory owners, industrialists. They're becoming hugely wealthy very, very fast, and so wealthy that they can also impact politics. So there is a long-term battle between the industrialists as this rising source of wealth that demand more political power from the landowners, and the landowners falling in wealth. To the point today that mostly political power is mostly held in the industrialized areas by the industrialists, the big business owners, big corporate executives and stock owners and whatnot. They're the ones that tend to have so much money that they can bribe politicians or buy up political power in one way or another. But back in the 1800s, that was in transition. And whenever you get the rise of a new group into power, they will fight for more power for themselves, and the old group will fight to keep as much power as they possibly can. So there's a lot of political infighting also. And there's also a feeling from the French Revolution that's still pretty prevalent in the 1800s, that when the people see that things are pretty miserable, that all they have to do is rise up and something good will happen. They start thinking about the French Revolution by the mid-1800s. Of course, the next generations that are only reading about the French Revolution in books. They didn't really participate in it. They start viewing the French Revolution as a very romantic thing where the people rise up and they help each other and they overthrow the tyrants and everything was good after that. We know that wasn't exactly the case, but that's often what happens with romantic thinkers. They don't pay attention to reality so much. They are swept up in the emotion of something. Okay. So there's a kind of resurgent liberalism going on in the 1840s also. The revolution starts again in France. There are riots that break out in February 1848 in Paris and spread to much of the rest of France. And the king that was put in place in 1830 in the previous revolution refuses to order the French troops out into the streets to massacre the people and to convince them to go home. So this is Louis Égalité. And within 2 days of the rioting really breaking out and spreading like wildfire, his decision is not to send out the military, and his government falls literally within 2 days. Whenever I look at this picture, I can't help but say, at this point, Elvis leaves the building. Just like Elvis. Every time I look at him, I don't know why. And if you saw South Park last night, oh man. The Hawaiians, did you see that? With like Elvis being their theoretical leader because he's the king and he made movies in Hawaii. It's pretty ridiculous. I loved it, but I love things like that. Okay, so the revolution starts in France, kicks the king out, and they declare France to be a republic again. Well, they are going to start to have democracy and voting rights. They'll determine their own leaders. That idea sweeps through the rest of Europe very, very fast. So all these different places where you see these kind of little explosion marks, or whatever you call them, those are the cities where revolutions hit. There are about 50 or so different revolutions that hit within about a month or two. So this spreads like crazy, and that's why 1848 is seen as such an important year. You can see that the vast majority of them are located in Central Europe, the German areas, northern Italy, some in southern Italy, and spreading into Eastern Europe. A lot of these, especially in Austria, are independence movements. Austria was a multinational empire, had Hungarians, eventually even Romanians, and all kinds of different peoples who speak all kinds of different languages. So a lot of the Austrian revolts are literally independence movements by people, especially the Hungarians, who want their own government. The major problem for the German areas is that, again, Germany is divided down between a few hundred different independent governments, And no one monarch or prince or duke or whoever runs your local place has enough of an army to actually fight against the rising up of their own people. So they don't have enough military power to repress this wave. And the revolutions in the Germanies are very interesting for many different reasons. In the summer of 1848, they formed what they called a PanGerman Parliament that meets in Frankfurt. And this is a major instance where German intellectuals, right down to college teachers, philosophy teachers and whatnot, economists, they go to this meeting to unite Germany into one country. And this is very much feared by the rest of Europe. So the Frankfurt Parliament is very, very famous, and it met to draw up a constitution and to establish a government for a united Germany. So that's a famous painting of it. So they write up a constitution. That's a fairly liberal constitution. They are a kind of constitutional convention, so they don't have an army to themselves to actually enforce this kind of constitution. And they don't have, they're not big political representatives. They're not usually members of German governments. So they feel they have to get someone powerful on their side to actually make this a reality. They offer it first. They offer the kingship of Germany to the Austrian king. And the Austrian king doesn't want to do it. So then they take it to the Prussian king as a kind of secondary choice, Prussia being by far the most powerful German state up in northern Germany. His name's Wilhelm or William IV. And Wilhelm has a big decision to make. Does he want to be king of this new German government? Or does he want to take his chances with something else? He decides to reject it. Mostly because he knew that if Germany became unified as one country, that the rest of the European governments would very much fear it. Germany would have the largest population, some of the most industry, by far the largest, most powerful army. So that if Germany became a unified reality, that it may be attacked by Russia or France or these other countries that fear the power of a united Germany. They would basically conspire to strangle it at birth. Also, the king wants to stay king. He wants to be an absolutist leader. And he's not going to get that with this constitution. He is going to be a constitutional monarch where he can run the executive branch but would not have the power to create laws himself. So he rejects it. He doesn't want to have a liberal representative parliament that is going to do whatever it wants, that he has to accept. So he's going to reject this offer and try to think of ways to unify Germany in other ways at other times. And he understands that in the long term, this could be a lesson to the European peoples, and especially the German peoples, that if they just rise up and they kind of come together again, that they could change government structures. And he didn't want to be a leader of a government that could be changed by such a movement at any time. Thought that was not stable enough for his liking. So he turns it down also. And at that point, the Frankfurt Parliament basically collapses. They all go back home. It was a failure. So questions about this at all? No. Okay. And in general, the 1848 revolutions get some change, but not nearly as much as most of the revolutionaries were demanded. So some of the major accomplishments, they do complain so much that many of the European governments get rid of their, especially foreign policy leaders, like that guy Metternich, who had been in place since the early 1800s. So a lot of the long-term conservative powers are thrown out and a new generation is brought in. But again, they're brought in under the old system, so that's not going to really do much for a lot of people. A second big accomplishment is after 1848 that people realized that you can't just rise up and expect things to turn out well for you. That is not the reality of politics. So they start identifying this kind of stuff as a very romantic movement, a kind of emotional movement, that if you believe that something is great, that everything's going to turn out great. That's not the reality. So they, after 1848, turned to more real-world political movements to try to affect change. And they'll start to turn away from these romantic ideas and turn to what they call realism. And realism becomes a big movement in art and politics and theory and intellectual fad. And that's where they start turning to things like Marx. You know, Marx had a real-world critique of what was going on. And of course, Marx published a Communist Manifesto this year because he thought this was the great uprising of the people, and he had a good message for people in his mind. He thought he knew the trick. He knew what to do. And the last major thing that this accomplishes is that basically all the European leaders who survived this thing have a deep fear of their own people. The European leaders are always aware, or try to stay aware, of the popular mood. Because as industrialization grows and goes faster and faster, there is always the threat of mass revolution from the masses, from the people, a mass uprising. So the European leaders try to keep very aware of that, and they worry about it decade after decade as time goes on. The major failures, though, are pretty obvious. The biggest failure, all these things are really the result of, just like a lot of uprisings today, for example, like this Occupy thing that's been going on, you tend to get a lot of different groups that want a lot of different things. And they tend to not agree amongst themselves about what they should do. And you start getting infighting and whatnot amongst the masses about what should happen. And the only thing they agree on is that the system as it exists sucks. We have to change things. And you start asking, what do you want to change? And you get a whole lot of different ideas, and they start fighting amongst themselves. So a lot of the major political problems that we see today and problems of mass uprisings are very similar to what we've seen before. And a lot of these revolutionary types of thinkers are a little too romantic. They have their head in the clouds. They try to build utopias and whatnot instead of building real-world political systematic solutions. And later revolutions will be much more interested in real-world criticism rather than just coming together and thinking that things are going to turn out all right. They'll try to come up with more detailed solutions. And for example, eventually they called the Frankfurt Parliament the Professors' Parliament. You have these kind of bigwig intellectuals who all get together and say, what's the perfect society we should build up? And they draw it up, and then it doesn't actually happen. And again, there's a whole lot of the revolutionaries who don't want to completely overthrow the system as it existed. They just want to tweak it. They want to change it to make it better or more egalitarian or more responsive to the needs of the people. And a lot of those reformers are very much pushed forward into more radical statements by the more hardcore revolutionaries who really do want to violently overthrow the system. So there's that kind of interplay going on within the movements themselves. And of course, the conservatives sit back, are often pushed back, and they don't want to make many big statements themselves because they see what's going on within the movements, and they understand that the movements can break themselves down through their own infighting. So a lot of the power structures and the wealthy elite who had power within the existing system, they don't want to respond very quickly because they realize that the movement that's pushing against them can collapse just by itself. So they bide their time, and when the revolutionary movements start to break apart, the elites largely either keep power or they come back into power where they had been knocked out. So eventually, the 1848 revolutions fail. They do not create very many new systems, and they do not overthrow a whole lot of monarchs and build something completely new. The monarchs tend to come back in one way or another. So 1848 is seen, even in the 1800s, was seen as a massive failure of the uprisings. And people were very disappointed and disillusioned with the idea of revolution going into the later 1800s. So questions about this at all? Yeah?
What did the English people, the British people, think of all these revolutions in Europe?
Well, you don't get many big revolutions in Europe, even in 1848. There's some uprisings and some complaints, but not a systematic attempt to overthrow the system. That's largely because the British government, starting in the 1820s, began passing laws to try to address the problems of industrialization. They pass laws by their own choice to end slavery. They pass, what we think of as like industrial laws for better working conditions and minimum wages and things like that. They pass laws to rebuild cities, to have public sewage systems built. The British are one of the more liberal responses amongst governments to the plight of their people. And they had but they're on the path to dealing with so many of those problems that the British people have a lot less to complain about than people, especially in Eastern Europe. And it's the reign, especially of Queen Victoria, is very interesting. Started off, her and her government were very hardcore conservatives, didn't want to change things, and said that the people shouldn't complain, they should, accept the role of government and support the government. But as the decades went on, it became increasingly interested in dealing with those problems and trying to find systematic ways of solving those problems. So that's why Victoria's government is so heavily studied, because it's seen as a precursor of a lot of kind of popular governments today that, if government problems continue, politicians get voted out of office. People get mad. So it's seen as a kind of one of the more modern styles of government back then, and one that's much more responsive to popular demands. Other questions? No. Okay. The 1800s also saw a massive consolidation movement. And one that a lot of historians actually ignore is the growth in power of the United States. When we last talked about the United States, there were 13 little governments along the Atlantic coastline, very weak and easy to push around, even up till the end of Napoleon. When the Americans went to war against Britain in 1812, they were invaded, their capital city was destroyed. I mean, they really got kicked around in that war. And after that war, the American leadership was very concerned with building up American power for the long term, at least to resist European incursions into their area anymore. One way of doing that was to get more land. So they bought the Louisiana Territory from New Orleans all the way to the border with Canada, up to the Rocky Mountains. Bought all that land straight out from Napoleon, which literally doubled the size of their country overnight. They then invaded Florida, which was a Spanish colony, took that from Spain, and in the 1840s started a war against Mexico, which was an independent government by that point, had broken away from Spain. Invaded Mexico, conquered Mexico City, and took land all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So within literally just about 45 years, you see the growth of the United States from just a small country from the Mississippi River eastward to a major continental power. And in doing this, the United States caused the problems the question over extending slavery into all this land basically caused a civil war. So after they fight the Civil War, that ends in 1865. The United States launches into industrialization to take advantage of all this land, to build up factories. The United States will eventually get one of the largest populations in the world. And when they start efficiently building up industry to take advantage of all these natural resources, the United States launches on a path of world power, where the United States will become the preeminent power in the world at around World War I. And if you just look at map of the world, look at the size of the United States and compare it to the size of Europe. It's very easy to understand at that point how the United States accumulates world power. So many Europeans in the late 1800s are looking at the United States saying, the United States is rising in power. Once they get their act together, they will be able to push Europe around by themselves. And it largely happens within about 50 years. So that's much of the story of the late 1800s with the comparison of the U.S. to Europe. And a lot of the rest of the semester is going to talk about the role of the United States in the world. That's what the United States eventually will look like. Let's get past that. Another place of consolidation is France. So France went into revolution in 1848, overthrew their king, established a republic, a representative democracy, and they held elections for president. And the nephew of the old Napoleon runs for president. He calls himself Napoleon III because Napoleon is a big famous word in France. Napoleon, there's Napoleon the First, the Napoleon, right? When he abdicated, I think it was the second time, he put his child's son on the throne, so that child's son was like Napoleon II for about 3 or 4 hours. So he was knocked out. And when this guy comes back, he calls himself Napoleon III. He's Napoleon's nephew. So he runs for president of France in the 1848 elections and actually wins. Probably because of the strength of his name. A couple years later, he asked the French people if they would like him to serve a 10-year term, which would have had to change the French Constitution. So they have a vote that is literally yes or no. Do you want Napoleon to be a 10-year president? There's a lot of questions about how accurate that vote is. There appears to be a lot of fraud, but he did win that. So he is elected to a 10-year term. And the next year, a new ballot comes out. Do you want Napoleon to be declared emperor? Yes or no? And again, there's a lot of accusations of fraud and whatnot, but he wins that vote too. So he calls himself again Emperor of the French. And he'll be around for about 20 years. How does he get away with this stuff? He promises and succeeds in building a lot of things for the mass public. He builds a lot of roads. He builds a lot of canals. He starts connecting the cities on an industrial level. And one of the biggest and most famous things he did was to rebuild Paris. He and his architects, his planners, literally, Paris was basically a medieval town still. It was haphazardly built. It had small little roads, and it was just a giant, confusing thing. It was difficult to move around. So he and his advisors went through and replanned Paris, and piece by piece knocked it down and rebuilt it. Rebuilt it to have wide streets so that modern cars and trains could go through, giant buildings. They literally rebuilt almost the whole city within about 10 years. And if you ever see art from this period, there's a lot of very famous paintings portraying what the new Paris looked like, with wide boulevards. So he got away with some of these questionable votes and got into office and stayed in office by basically building up France to be a modern industrialized economy and society. So he was fairly popular for quite a while in France, and he'll be around until the 1870s. Italy is also unified over a very long process that we just do not have the time to get into the details of. We're not going to have time to discuss all this, but basically one of the kings of one of the Italian states started launching invasions of other places, bringing together more and more land under this one kingship, and then signing international treaties where others would recognize it. The general in charge of a lot of these invasions is named Garibaldi, and the kind of leader, political and diplomatic leader of this movement is named Cavour. So these are two very famous personalities in Italian history. So if you ever go to Italy, you often see streets and whatnot named after these two. But again, we don't have time to get into the details. The big one, though, is Germany. Even after 1848, there is a social movement to bring the Germans together. They say we have ancient ancestral connections, cultural connections with each other. There's no reason we should be broken down into 200 some odd different states, different governments. And that they recognize that this had happened over 1,000 years because the other European powers wanted it that way. The British wanted it that way, the French, the Austrians. They were always very afraid that if the Germans ever get together and organize themselves, that Germany, a united Germany, would be militarily powerful, if not unstoppable. So largely, the King of Prussia and his political kind of diplomatic leader named Bismarck started trying to come up with ways of unifying the German people and gathering popular support for a unified Germany. One of the ways of doing this was to start a war against Austria. Prussia and Austria were very much rivals for who should lead a unified Germany. So a lot of the Germans wanted a unified Germany. They couldn't decide whether the King of Austria should become the King of Germany, or the King of Prussia should become the King of Germany. So there's a rivalry between the two. Bismarck largely conspires to create a war against Austria. Austria is militarily weak at this point, seen as one of the weaker major powers in Europe. So the Prussians invade Austria. They really kick around the Austrian armies for a couple weeks and then stop the war. And Bismarck stopped the war short because he didn't want to conquer all of Austria and dominate it and overthrow its government. And he feared that the continued fighting amongst German-speaking types of people would upset the German people. They're fighting often their cousins and whatnot. So it's a cultural thing. And he was very much afraid that if this war went on too long, that the Russians would intervene or the French would intervene or something like that. And Bismarck didn't want to have any part of that. So the humiliating loss, and especially the re-emerging negotiations between the Hungarians about whether Hungary should be independent, this creates a new type of government for Austria where they create what they call the dual monarchy. Basically, Hungary will be somewhat independent. They'll have their own parliament. They can theoretically make their own laws. But they still fall under the power of the Austrian king. So you have this so-called Austria/Hungary country going into the future. But Bismarck caused this war to happen because he wanted to prove to the German people which side was stronger. And after it happened, there just wasn't much question anymore. Bismarck's next plan is to start another war against one of the ancient enemies of the German people, the French. So Bismarck comes to believe that the German nationalists will be brought together by declaring war against France. So again, he conspires basically to create a war against France in order to bring the Germans together under Prussian leadership. And just like with Austria, the Prussians invade France. They run circles around the French armies. The French armies seem fairly disorganized. They kicked the French armies around pretty badly for quite a while, for about 6 or 7 weeks or so. They even capture Napoleon III, the French monarch, the French emperor. They surround Paris. And they demand that Paris, the capital city, surrender to the German invasion. And the people in Paris say, we're going to keep fighting. We don't really care what you do with Napoleon. He was a bad guy anyway. They basically put a gun to Napoleon's head and said, you better surrender or we'll kill him. And the French people said, Go ahead, kill him. Who cares? It's kind of funny instance. So that's how Napoleon III goes out of office. He's captured, and then the French people refuse to fight for him. So there is a new government in Paris. This is where you get this thing called the Paris Commune, where the people try to really run Paris almost like a communistic society, where they're trying to just stay alive in the face of this German invasion. It doesn't work for very long. They eventually give up in January 1871. And the negotiations that happen in Paris and at Versailles, the ancient home of the French monarchy, ever since Louis XIV in the late 1600s, is a place where they write the treaty. So the 1871 treaty that ends the war between Germany and France, literally in the treaty creates the unified Germany. And this treaty is written in the home of the French monarchy, Versailles. And it's a very famous painting of it. So the current king of Prussia, Wilhelm I, is made into the first king of Germany, or the Kaiser. The political genius who accomplished all this stuff, Otto von Bismarck, because everybody knew that he was, or at least the German king understood that he was the political genius who accomplished all this. Bismarck is kept around to basically run the new German government and run foreign policy. With the theory being, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. He's done a good job. You don't want to kick him out. He'll probably continue doing a good job. So Bismarck will be in control, basically, of the German government. He'll be running things as long as Wilhelm I is on the throne. And interestingly, one of the things that Bismarck had to promise to the German people to get their support for united Germany, for this new government, is to give them health insurance. The German health insurance system, the state system, is called the Bismarck system. And that's been a demand of the German people for a long time ever since. And it's still in place today. Let's see. So this is what Europe looks like, 1871, when Germany is united, and you have united Italy below. But the unification of Germany is a big turning point in European history. Why? Because united Germany now immediately has the biggest population in Europe, biggest, most powerful army, the most industry. Germany now goes beyond Britain. Germany is now the industrial powerhouse of Europe. And all the countries around Germany fear it, especially France. So the French, the British, the Russians, the Austrians, they all fear the growth of German power and the potential for Germany to invade their own lands and possibly conquer the rest of Europe the way Napoleon had tried. And Bismarck understood this, and he understood it very deeply. Bismarck goes to the German leaders, especially the foreign policy and military leaders, and says, France is going to attack us at some point. So he says, war against France is inevitable. It will happen at some point. The trick that Bismarck wants to use to win that future war is to separate France diplomatically from the rest of the Europeans. He says, if we have to fight France, then we should make sure that France has no allies in that war. And Bismarck is a diplomatic genius at guaranteeing that doesn't happen. He keeps the French separated from the Russians, separated from the British. And Bismarck's great fear was that the promotion of Germany to being the most powerful would convince the rest of the Europeans to attack Germany immediately and again, strangle it at birth. Kill it as fast as possible so it doesn't become a threat. So Bismarck's statement to the rest of the Europeans is, Germany just wants to be unified, it will be peaceful, it won't start wars, and it does not want to create a large international empire. So it was basically sending a message to Britain especially, we're not going to challenge the British Empire in the world. We just want to have a unified Germany. And that was Bismarck's foreign policy. And it worked for a long time. And this is Bismarck here on the left. It worked until that king died. The king was a great supporter of Bismarck. The next in line for the throne dies just a couple months later. So the guy who was trained to run Germany as the new king for his lifetime doesn't last long. So the secondary son of this king, the second in line guy, rises up, and this guy does not like Bismarck at all. Doesn't trust Bismarck, and this guy is very much believing that the king should be running the country. So he eventually gets Bismarck tossed out of the government. And that king will go on to make one stupid mistake after another that leads into World War I and the destruction of that monarchy. So, yep, we'll stop there. So any questions with that? Yeah.
Who is that king?
It's Wilhelm II. I think that's it. Yeah.